you a little bit more. Okay. All right. Tip number 2 is have a balanced college list. Okay. So you probably heard this before. And in fact, your school counselors will definitely urge you to have a little bit more balance on your list, to be sure. But it's really important that you make sure that your admissions data is up to date. Okay, because if you're relying on information that is maybe even 2 or 3 years old, you can really misjudge a school and label it like a safety school when it's really not a safety, right? One really dire example of this is Northeastern. I think I mentioned this earlier. Their acceptance rate last year was at 6.7%. But even just as recently as 2021, the year before, their acceptance rate was 18.4%. Now, it dropped dramatically because there was an extenuating circumstance here, right? I think they had over-enrolled the previous year and they didn't have enough space, I guess. And so they actually had to drastically cut the size of the incoming class. But even though they haven't released it yet, though, I have been hearing that it didn't really jump back up to about 18%, that Northeastern is really going to be under 10% now. Okay, so yes, even though there are going to be cases like this, you should still definitely aim for some prestigious and reach schools on your list. Just because every single year at HS2, we've had success stories of students who didn't even think they can get in, right? So these certain schools are maybe labeled out of their reach or maybe too far out. You should really at least have 1 or 2 of these dream schools that you should try for, even if it doesn't look like numerically you have a shot. Okay, just because, like I said, you never know, right? The admissions office might really like something about your profile, and they might decide to give you a chance, even if your numbers don't necessarily reflect the averages of the average student who's accepted to their school. Okay, so it's definitely worth a try. You definitely just want to go ahead and make sure to give yourself, a little bit of that, chance to be considered. Okay. However, at the same time, you also have to make sure that your safeties are indeed safeties. Now, it's really key that you do some research, not just in the overall acceptance rates of the schools that you're considering, but also if you're applying to certain popular majors like business, engineering, or computer science, to find out whether or not there's data about these schools' acceptance rates for those majors. So a couple of key examples here, right? So the University of Washington, pretty popular school for California students because it's not too far, right? Has a stated acceptance rate of 53.5%. But if you were to look at their website, if you're an out-of-state student and you're applying for computer science, your acceptance rate is a paltry 3%. That's really scary. Purdue was a school that many people widely considered a safety, maybe as recently as 5 or 10 years ago. But if you're applying for engineering, the 68.8% published acceptance rate drops down to about 37% for engineering and as low as 10 to 15% for computer science. They hadn't published the exact numbers, but this is kind of the range that they were saying. Okay, so definitely do your research, right? Try to figure out whether or not something is indeed a safety school for you or whether or not you had just mislabeled it. Okay, so it's a good practice to also have a more even distribution of reach, target, or safety schools, right? This is exactly what we mean by having a balanced college list, because ideally you do want to have some choices. You do want to be able to kind of compare, because if your list is too top heavy, if you're applying to 8 or 9 total dream reach schools and then just maybe have 1 or 2 backup schools, oftentimes, especially if you just misjudged even those backup schools, you could find yourself in a situation where you could have gotten into only 2 or 1 or even no schools, right? And that's kind of a dreadful situation to be in, because then at that point, you're scrounging to see whether or not some schools might still be accepting applications, or you may end up having to do a year or 2 in community college and then just go through this process again. Okay, so this is an example, I guess, of someone who would be applying for engineering. As you can see here, the student would be, willing to take some risks going for top schools like Cornell, Carnegie Mellon, USC, like I said, is now under 10%. So it would probably be a reach school for many of you, right? Their target schools are Georgia Tech, Rensselaer Polytechnic, and UIUC, right? So the student for engineering would be still pretty competitive for those schools. And then their backup schools, if they wanted to stay closer to home, there's Loyola Marymount in the Los Angeles area and Santa Clara up in the Bay Area. And then Penn State is oftentimes a very good backup school for fields like business or engineering, because Their undergrad ranking for those things are pretty high, but the acceptance rates are actually pretty decent even for those majors, okay? So while I gave an example here of maybe like something like 9 colleges, the actual number might vary depending on how many you want to try for. Some of you might be attending schools where your school puts a cap in terms of how many schools you apply to. In that case, of course, you do want to adhere to that as best you can. Otherwise, most students that we've worked with will apply to something like 10 to 15 colleges and then apply to the University of California system, okay? Because that's one system application, so we generally view it as just like one slot or one application, okay? All right, tip number 3. Make the essay portray you positively. I think that's kind of a no-brainer, but I do want to dig deeper into that because there is something that is now becoming more of a trend. So we normally attend the NACAC conference every single year. So NACAC stands for the National Association for College Admissions Counselors. So this is the governing body of all college admissions officers and guidance counselors at high schools. And based on one of the more recent surveys, they actually listed some of the key factors that they look at. And based on this recent survey, one of the key items that is now rising the charts in terms of factors that colleges deem very important is this category called positive character attributes. Okay, yes, that is really vague, right? And we'll kind of like dissect what that means in a little bit. But I wanted to discuss it in terms of the essay because just below that is the essay, okay, in terms of order of importance. And I think they're very, very linked. In fact, the essay is probably the single most important place where you can demonstrate these positive character attributes. And true enough, as part of the survey, they actually rated that as the #1 place that they look at to determine whether or not you show the kind of character that they're looking for. So 86.7% of the polled say that the content of the essay or the personal statement is what they look at the most, okay? Followed then by your teacher or counselor recommendations, your extracurriculars, and then of course there's the interview, okay? So as you can see, the essay is going to be really pivotal in terms of really portraying yourself as the type of person and student that they're looking for, right? So yeah, so what does this mean? What is character, right? So based on that same survey, there was an article trying to dissect exactly that, right? How is character defined and measured? Okay, so according to Dr. Mark Drozdowski, right, he broke it down in terms of what character means, and they can sort of sort it out into these various attributes like resilience, service, curiosity, perseverance, respect, kindness, integrity, just being a good overall person, I guess. Okay, but some other factors too are compassion, gratitude, grit, growth mindset, perspective taking, purpose, and self-control. So I guess the key distinction here is that they wanted to see that you're a good ethical person, which are things like empathy and compassion, but there are also things that are tied into your achievement or your performance, showing that you're hardworking, that you're resilient, and that you're very diligent, right? So those are all, part of what it means to be the type of person they want. They want someone who is a good, upstanding citizen, very moral, very ethical, but also someone who's hardworking, diligent, shows a lot of passion for their studies. So that's really what you want to incorporate in your various essays, not just in your personal statement, but also in like the supplemental essays that they have you write. Okay, so how does this relate to the essay? Well, your personal statement is effectively your face to college admissions officers, right? So yeah, so pretty much when you are doing admissions work, and I had, the privilege of looking at grad school admissions offices or applications when I was doing grad work at Harvard, I never got to see any of the people whose applications I was reading, but the essays gave me some sort of an idea of what type of a person this applicant was. Right. And generally speaking, the essays are evaluated not just as a writing sample, right? Because it is looked at as a way to judge, like, how well do you write? How well do you articulate your thoughts and your ideas? But it's also looked at as a way to sort of almost psychoanalyze an applicant. What kind of person is he or she? Okay, what is important to them, or what do they demonstrate in this essay that lets us know that they would be a good fit for the type of community that we're trying to form? And so, having said that, that's really an important thing when you're trying to write your personal statement. You do not just want to think of any interesting or fancy story about yourself and then just start with that especially if whatever story you're trying to tell doesn't really have a good point about the type of person you are. So I normally suggest to students that you kind of want to just reverse engineer it, right? So try to think about like certain qualities or traits that you possess that you want to highlight to the admissions office, right? So if you're really a very kind, compassionate person and you do a lot of volunteering, and this is definitely something that many people see as a trait that they think about when they think of you, then sure, go ahead and craft a narrative that tells the story of maybe something that you are very passionate about and a cause that you're trying to serve, maybe people that you would want to work with, you had worked with in the past, right? If let's say, for example, you're just very tenacious academically, right? You have this, insatiable curiosity. If that's something that defines you in terms of your activities and your relationships with other people, then of course that would make for a logical place for you to tell your story when you're writing your essay, okay? So for the Common App essay, this is widely viewed as your personal statement. It is perfectly acceptable to write in a way that's less formal, right? You don't have to have like a thesis or topic sentences. You can write it almost like a story, right? And in fact, that's kind of the convention, that's the norm for it to almost read like a biographical reflection or autobiographical reflection, or like, it'll feel like an exercise in creative writing in some cases, right? You'll use dialogue, you'll use scene setting and everything, okay? All right. Now, of course, it's also important to remember that this essay should focus on you. So even if, let's say, for example, you do want to write an essay about influences in your life, right? Your family, maybe a mentor like a teacher or a coach, it should still be more like a 60-40 balance where 60% is about you and 40% is about that person. You should still bring it back to how these people impacted you, right? And demonstrate to them how this influence was kind of shown in your life. Okay. It's also important to avoid cliche topics. Now, it's kind of hard sometimes to know whether or not the idea that you have is cliche. That's kind of why it's important to get the advice of your school counselors, maybe some of your teachers, like an English teacher would be a good sounding off board. That's why HS2 counselors are oftentimes a really good resource, because we've had experience seeing dozens, if not hundreds upon hundreds of essays. And so we can tell you whether or not an essay topic might come across as a bit cliche to admissions officers, right? Because if we're looking at certain essays and, on the typical year, we'll probably see like a couple hundred essays. The admissions people who read these things, and that's all they do, will probably read something like a couple thousand essays every single application cycle, right? And a couple thousand of them, if they all sound the same, right, that's not good, right? So, there can be certain kind of like cliche or trope essays. Like I put a couple here that I typically hear a lot. There's the sports triumph essay. This is kind of like the whole Rocky montage thing. You got cut from your team as a freshman, but you worked hard and you trained and eventually made the team as a sophomore or junior, and you guys made it all the way to the state championships, right? That's a fairly predictable story arc. Here's another thing too. That arc does not necessarily limit itself to just sports, right? That same kind of story arc can be found in a debate essay, or let's say, or an academic essay, we're talking about your grades, right? If it's fairly predictable, that's not good, okay? If they can already kind of figure out what the ending of your essay is going to be. There are tragedy essays. While college admissions people tend to be sympathetic to, things that happen to you that are oftentimes very tragic or very, definitely very negative, you don't necessarily get into top colleges just because they feel sorry for you, right? So if you were to write on a certain kind of like tragic situation, you do want to talk about the growth process, how this event has shaped you and how you've grown from the process, rather than like relying on pathos and very emotional sort of like language in order to elicit sympathy, right? Because like I said, a top school isn't really just going to accept you just because they feel sorry for you. In fact, there have been articles and discussions about like the COVID essay, right? There's some that require a COVID essay where at some point, like admissions people suffered from what's called like COVID fatigue. They just got tired of reading a lot, even though, yes, they feel sorry for people who had lost maybe a family member during COVID. At some point, if you're hearing a lot of these essays and they all sound similar, you don't really stand out as much. Okay. There's also what I call the exotic journey essay, right? So you do a mission trip somewhere, or you talk about your experiences traveling to another country, right? So in and of itself, that's not going to get you in. But if the experience of traveling has really widened, or broadened your horizons or your understanding of other cultures, I think that's valid, but you don't necessarily want to just write about it like an exotic travel destination, okay? Because that in and of itself is not going to get the job done. Okay, you also want to try to bounce your ideas off of other people who know you well. So I'd say getting the advice from like your family and friends could be really crucial because they've known you for many years. And in fact, in the case of your parents, they've known you your whole life, right? So they could be a vital, sounding board for you to figure out whether or not the topics that you write about in your essay ring true to them about the type of person you are, okay? And then above all else, do make sure that the essay sounds like you. Don't try to fake it and sound like someone you're not, okay? Colleges have gotten good at spotting fakes. And please, for the love of God, do not be tempted to go ahead and recycle someone else's essay or have someone write the essay for you. Colleges do use things like Turnitin.com. They can even, like these days, they've even been on top of the whole ChatGPT phenomenon, and they do have various ways to detect whether or not you use ChatGPT to write your college essay, right? So please do make sure that this is something you've done as an original piece of work, okay? The next point here is to ace the interview. Okay, as I said, the interview is still a pretty important component in terms of your overall college applications. So some tips for this is that it's one of the few times that you do have to be able to make a face-to-face impression, even if it's not necessarily in person, even if it's the Zoom interview. They at least get to talk to you, they get to see your face, they get to at least interact with you, right? So since most of the application is just on paper, this is a good way for you to kind of like humanize the process. It's also a great opportunity for some students who are much more outgoing, right? So let's say on paper, based on your activities, you do seem kind of like stereotypically Asian, right? But if you want to show off that, no, I definitely don't consider myself to be kind of like a very, generic applicant for this major or that major, the interview could be a great way to be able to kind of show your uniqueness, right? To show your personality. If you pride yourself on your sense of humor, the interview could be a great way to showcase that as well, okay? And it's a great way to get someone else to advocate for you, because if you can impress the admissions interviewer, then that person will be writing a report about you, and it can have, at the end of the day, the same impact as a really strong recommendation letter on your behalf. Okay, some other things too. For the actual interview, we typically tell students, make sure you prepare well in advance, make sure you've done research about the school that you're applying to, and make sure you know their majors, right? And or things like professors that you'd like to do research with. If they have any special programs that you're interested in, you do want to talk about that as well, okay? It's probably not a good idea to script out your whole answers to these questions, even if you do have access to some sample questions. It's good to have talking points, right? Go into that interview saying like, okay, I want to walk out of this interview having talked about at least 4 or 5 important things, right? So have goals for the interview in terms of what you want to really share with the interviewer, okay? And then practice. Practice makes perfect. So this way you don't sound like robotic or rehearsed. If you practiced enough with a friend or with a family member, you can come across sounding very polished, very confident, and someone who's very interested in their school, okay? And then of course, to top it all off, you probably want to have a really updated, very impressive looking resume. Okay, so these are all things that will help you shine in terms of the interview process itself. Okay, next up here, impress your recommenders. So this is one of these things where people think that, oh, I just need to think of recommendation letters by the time it's the end of my junior year. That's not necessarily true. Getting good recommendation letters starts early, right? Even as early as freshman or sophomore year, in fact, believe it or not. Okay. And the reason for this is that, like, having been a teacher myself, I taught AP English at a high school for a couple of years. I know that people talk in the faculty lounge, right? So your reputation precedes you. And so if you slack off or you're lazy or you're a troublemaker in your 9th or 10th grade English classes, I would probably have heard about it. And I already might have formed an impression of you by the time I have you in 11th grade, let's just say. Okay, of course, teachers can change their perceptions of you. You can prove their initial impressions wrong, of course, but sometimes it's very hard to undo an impression of you that they might have gotten early on, right? And so I do want to make sure that, like, you impress your teachers even at an early age, right? Ideally, though, you do want to focus on your 11th grade teachers when it's finally time to ask for recommendations, because typically 11th grade is going to be the most recent year where the teachers will have known you for one full year. Also, 11th grade, typically for most high schools, tends to be the most rigorous, most competitive year thus far, which means this is where you would most likely have rec letters from like your AP teachers, right? If possible, you would want to prioritize those teachers, because if they're saying good things about you, they're comparing you to a pool of other AP level students. Okay, it's not as impressive if, let's say, for example, you're taking regular math or regular English and they're saying, oh, she's a great student. Okay, it's more impressive to say like, well, I've been teaching AP US history for the past 5 years, and she is one of the best students I've ever had, right? That's definitely a better way to impress admissions officers, right? Ideally, if you can help it, you would want a balance between one STEM and one non-STEM teacher. But above all else, though, you would still want to go with your 2 best recommenders. If they happen to be both STEM, great, just go with that. But if you have 3 or 4 teachers who are willing to write you excellent recommendations, then you have the luxury of going with one maybe STEM teacher and one non-STEM. There are 2 schools that notably have that sort of requirement as a set hard rule, and that's MIT and Caltech, right? For all of the schools, I think you're probably just better off going with your 2 strongest recommenders at that point, okay? And then, like we said earlier about like submitting early, you also want to ask your teachers early, right? One easy way to annoy a possible like recommendation writer is by asking them very last minute, especially during a busy school year and they have a lot on their plate, and or many people already asked them to write a rec letter. So it's best to go ahead and typically what I like to say is do a soft ask at the end of junior year and then follow up at the beginning of senior year. Okay, that way you kind of already gave them a little bit of notice and say like, oh, Mrs. So-and-so, is it okay if I ask you to write me a recommendation letter next year when I'm a senior? Okay, that way they already know. If they say yes, sure, absolutely, go ahead and look me up maybe during the school year, or some teachers may even want to write the rec letter during the summer. So even asking them sometime in May, before the end of junior year, makes a lot of sense. Hey, if you're a rising senior now, it's not too late, but definitely try to hit up your teachers at the beginning of the school year, right? Don't wait too long, but also maybe don't pester them on the very first day of school, okay? Maybe wait until a little later in the week before you do that. Okay, now, teachers will not only be uploading a letter on your behalf, right, on the applications, they will also be asked to rate you based on a rubric of traits and qualities, much like this one. And so, of course, ideally, you want teachers to rate you in this very rightmost column, where it says one of the top few I've encountered, top 1%, but you may not be privy to this, right? So typically what I like students to do is instead of just saying like, oh, can you write me a rec letter? Preface that or qualify that by saying, would you be willing to write me a strong recommendation letter? I think that's a smarter way of approaching it, because if they're willing to write you a strong recommendation letter and they said yes, and you said strong, that's more confidence in knowing that they truly feel like you would be a good student at the school that they are applying to. Okay, so it makes a lot of sense for you to kind of like find out early. If you've asked them before, maybe for a summer program, and they're more than happy to do it, and you got into said summer program, that might be a good sign as well. So that's definitely one way to sort of test out or preview your recommendation letter writers. Okay. How do you impress teachers? This coming from a former AP teacher. Make sure you're participating in classroom discussions. Okay. It's not really just how often you speak though, but really how intelligently you add to the discussion, right? So if you're like have some smart observations about what's going on in the lectures, or you have things to contribute, that's going to impress me more. Okay. It's important for you to build the relationships with these teachers. So get to know them, talk to them, right? Before school, out of school. If you see them while you're at the football games, spark up a conversation, right? Although you can also do that maybe potentially too much. So don't do that to the point where it seems like you're hounding or harassing them, because sometimes it's just kind of creepy, guys. So, you might overdo it. Okay, you might also want to consider giving them thoughtful presents, maybe on their birthday or on Christmas. But I wouldn't recommend just having a lavishly expensive gift card, because then it sounds like it, or it looks like it's coming from your parents and not from you, right? So try to think of small but meaningful gifts that they would appreciate. Okay. And then lastly, if your teacher recommends certain outside activities like an extra field trip, or maybe they say like, oh, I recommend this short story to read, try to take advantage of that, because you're sending the signal that you're much more interested in learning about the subject above and beyond what they're teaching in class. Okay. All right. And the last tip for this evening is have activities that show you care, right? Remember, we're talking about character as now being one of the most important things that colleges look at. So colleges are now looking at things like volunteering or activities that show you're trying to make an impact, either in your school or your local community, right? So that's the key word here, is making an impact. Colleges want to see that people are taking the initiative to do things, or people are problem solvers, right? Keep in mind, the vast majority of colleges out there are actually nonprofit. Doesn't seem like that based on the amount of tuition they charge, but yes, they are nonprofit. So many of them are very mission oriented, right? There are certain goals in terms of what they want their graduates to do when they go out into the working world. Okay. So when you're looking at volunteering, it's important not just to simply rack up a certain amount of hours. You want to show your genuine passion for whatever fields that you are trying to help out with. Okay. There's not exactly a tier list as to which types of volunteering or community service are inherently more worthwhile. It's important just to find things that you really truly care about. Okay. And if you can, try to make meaningful connections with the people at these various organizations where you volunteer, because ultimately, above and beyond just a simple hours count, getting a strong recommendation letter from maybe someone who knows you from the volunteering context can be really important to show that this is something you are genuinely passionate about. Okay. In addition, part of this discussion about character stems from, there was a conference back in Harvard back in 2016 where colleges got together. And this is where, like, we've been seeing this since 2016, this growing emphasis on character, personality, like really trying to find people who are very ethical and people who want to make a difference in the world. Okay, so there are three main recommendations that came out of that conference. The first one is that they want to see meaningful, sustained community service. Of course, the operative word here is sustained. They want to see that students are working on volunteering with at least a year of sustained service. Okay. In the past, many students tried to just rack up a ton of hours doing just like one, maybe two volunteer trips. And that's the only volunteering they did in the entirety of high school. So that's not enough these days, right? You need to show consistent dedication to whatever causes that you want to volunteer doing. Okay. Also, if you can show that your volunteering takes on community challenges, I think that's more impressive as well, right? So if you were to find community service that is making a meaningful impact in either, like your local community or at your school, try to show that your efforts are in fact making an impact. You can do this in your essays, you can do this in the interview, okay? And then lastly, they recommend that your volunteering basically focuses on authentic, meaningful experiences with diversity. Okay, so if you can, try to find volunteer opportunities where you do interact with people from different walks of life, different socioeconomic backgrounds, because that is more in line with the goals of colleges when they put together diverse classes. It's not just diversity in the sense that you're coming from different backgrounds, but they also want people who thrive in these kinds of environments. So if, let's say, for example, well, I'm Asian, I'm not necessarily going to add a lot to the diversity of the campus just because of my race. You showing that you value this type of diversity also becomes important for them. Okay. Also, it's important for you to showcase your intellectual curiosity. Remember, when we were talking about character, it's not just you're a good ethical person. You also want to show that you are someone who has tenacity, determination. And so oftentimes admissions people have the stereotype of Asian students as being very hardworking, but not very intellectually creative. That's not necessarily true based on the experiences of many students that we worked with over the years. So you still want to try to find ways to defy those stereotypes though. So if you can go ahead and show in your application and your essays that you're very passionate about your field, okay, and you've done things above and beyond, let's say what's in the classroom, I think that can really help set you apart from other students who are just focused on getting a good grade. Okay, if you can, if it makes sense for your major, Try to participate in activities like research during the summer, because I think that can help you stand out even more, right? It shows that you're much more advanced. It shows that you are growing in terms of your passion for the field and your preparation to potentially do research down the line, right? Because if people are going all the way to get their PhD in the field, tell you what, that's what you're doing, right? Most of your PhD is you actually doing the research and then publishing that research in the form of your dissertation. So of course, showing that you're already into that process and interested in your field as early as high school can go a long way to show that you are much more determined, much more advanced than other applicants. Okay. Some schools like MIT, for instance, have now added something called the Maker Portfolio. So performance assessments are now this new thing that colleges are looking at. So if you can demonstrate above and beyond your grades that you're really passionate about your field, that would go a long way to show that you are the type of student they want. So let's say, for example, you're interested in computer science or engineering, show off your work, right? Show off some of the programs you've created, show some of the projects that you've been working on. The same could be true as well. If let's say you're an English major and you have a collection of short stories, or you have like a poem anthology, for instance, that can go to show colleges that you are truly creative and that you have more to contribute than just being a good student who gets good grades. Okay. So with that, I do want to talk about HS2 Academy and what we can do to help you out. So over the last 20 years, right, HS2 has been around for a little over 20 years now. We've had amazing results every single year. We pride ourselves on getting students accepted to the top colleges and universities across the country. But to be honest, we're really just as proud of students who get into schools that are maybe not as prestigious or well-ranked, but are still well above what the student was hoping to get into, right? So for us, it's really all about maximizing your potential and really trying to get you into the most competitive colleges that we can help you get into, okay? So one of the key things that we're really trying to target these days is we now have a partnership with USC to provide unique research opportunities for our students. And this is a year-long research program through the Mann School of Pharmacy. Now, of course, there are going to be some students who are not necessarily focused on, let's say, pre-med or natural sciences, but some of these internships will also use things like bioinformatics or computer science. So even if your field isn't necessarily something that on surface looks like it would be aligned with pharmacy, this could be a wonderful opportunity, because in most cases, many students will only get to do research during the summer, right? So this is a year-long research opportunity. Now, of course, it can be scaled or adjusted so that if you have more time in the summer, students will typically work more hours in the summer and then just work remotely with the professors during the school year. But there are opportunities for you to go down to USC and continue the research that you're working on as well. So in fact, just recently, we've had students start their first day, right, doing their internships. It's pretty rigorous. The students were there. It's like a job. They were there from 9 to 5. And they're working there with their mentors, who are all USC pharmacy school professors, right? So this is a wonderful opportunity. It also presents a unique pathway for students who, let's say, for example, USC is their dream school. It could be a wonderful opportunity to really be like distinguished, right? We're doing this in partnership with one of the USC trustees, and it could be a great way for you to potentially get a recommendation letter as well, okay? And that could really dramatically increase your chances of getting into a school like USC, okay? All right.